encuentro en la reunión de la Mont Pelerin Society, la sociedad Mont Pelerin en la Ciudad de México. Esta es una sociedad de la que son miembros los principales liberales, pensadores liberales en el mundo. Es una sociedad que se fundó en 1947 y que ha sido el lugar de reflexión y de pensamiento de los principales liberales, de quienes creen en la libertad económica, política y personal en todo el mundo. Y bueno, a mí me da mucho gusto conversar en este foro con James Tooley. Él es vicepresidente de la Universidad de Buckingham. Esta es una universidad del Reino Unido. Ser vicepresidente de la universidad lo hace, de hecho, responsable de toda la parte académica de la universidad. Y vamos a hacer esta conversación en idioma inglés. Professor James Tooley, thank you very much for this conversation. You have claimed that we can actually, or that you can actually take education to the highest levels in very poor societies. You have a book called The Beautiful Tree, which you claim that this can be done, and that there can be high levels of education in societies, in communities that are so poor that people thought they were beyond education.
Yes, yes. And you sort of said, I can do this, or we can do it.
You in general,
yeah.
you.
But the extraordinary thing is, my work has been, over the last quarter of a century, trying to answer that question, going into some of the poorest slums in the world, the poorest villages in the world, and finding that this extraordinary thing is happening. The poor themselves, poor villages, poor communities, poor slums, are saying that the government schools, the public schools, are not good enough for them. They see those schools as undermining education, as undermining what they want from their children. Maybe their children are abused in those schools. And instead, within these communities themselves, poor people are creating schools. They are private schools, which typically charge very low fees, affordable by those on the poverty line. And those schools are succeeding in many ways, one of which is the children in those outperform children in the government schools.
So when I say you, well, actually your answer is, it's not me, it's they're doing that.
And it is an extraordinary finding, because when I first got involved in this work 25 years ago, yes, it was all about me. I want to go into these poor areas and see how I can help. Yeah. And actually, I've said this in The Beautiful Tree, the book,
yes.
I was learning all the time about how to run education on a very low budget, how to improve the curriculum and teacher training on a very low budget. And that, it's a very important to stress. Now, I have got involved in various ways since, so one is not totally obsolete, but nonetheless, this is an extraordinary self-help phenomenon that is taking place.
Now, these are private schools. That's what's interesting. We've been told all the time, at least in Mexico, that private schools are for the rich, public schools are for the poor, and if not as good as the private schools, well, that's something that they have to deal with.
Yes, and that's interesting you should say that, because that was precisely what I believed 25 years ago. What everyone believed, that private schools are for the rich, the upper middle classes or whoever, and no one else can afford them. And so it was a discovery I made when I found these schools, these private schools, run properly as schools, properly private, owned by a proprietor or a husband and wife team or whatever, and they were genuinely serving poor communities. One of my books, I think, was called Private Schools Are Good for the Poor. And this was a phenomenon. And I found this all over the world. So my work started in India, Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, and also rural China. And then I extended the work to war-torn countries in Africa, Liberia, Sierra Leone, South Sudan, Somalia. And I even came across and did a bit of work in Central America as well, in Honduras, finding the same phenomenon. And it's interesting you should say that they're not known here, but my guess is in Mexico they're here too. But it needs a proper study to find out and go to the poorest places, see what is happening.
A lot of, leftist politicians in Mexico, they tell us that it is wrong to charge for education.
Yes.
It is wrong to have private schools, especially for children of the poor. Although what I've seen in Mexico is that the poor in Mexico are willing to make any sacrifice to send their children to a private school that offers better education.
Yeah, it's the most natural of instincts. And I always say that to to feed and clothe your children, to house them. These are natural instincts. To educate your children is another natural instinct that parents, poor parents as well have. So, but you talked about the leftists who say it's wrong to charge the poor. So this is what I say to those leftists. First of all, are the government schools, are the public schools any good? Would you send your children to the government schools that are serving those poor areas?
No, they always send them to private schools.
But they wouldn't go there. And they wouldn't go there for good reasons, because those government schools typically are very unionized, very dysfunctional, and not anywhere where you and I or the leftists would want to send their children. That's the first thing. The second thing is, okay, you've got a poor parent who's making a choice, and they are scrimping and saving. They're not having any luxuries. But they're saving up enough money to pay for a school fee. Are you going to look them in the eye and say, no, you're not allowed to do that. You've got to send your child to the public school, the government school, because that's the only place you're allowed? No, we allow choice. We want to have choice, and we want different types of schools to flourish. This is the amazing thing, that parents are preferring these schools. When you do questionnaires, what do you say is typical of private schools and public schools? They will go through the list, and they will say the private schools are superior in most respects, including respect for girl children, including lack of abuse, and government schools, no. They fall down on almost every indicator.
What's your position on what the Americans call the charter schools?
Yeah, they're interesting. They're not as interesting as the work I'm describing, because they are still publicly funded. Mm-hmm. They're still very regulated by the state, and the federal government and the state. They are often rationed. Places that them are rationed. A number of those schools are rationed. And so for me, I say that's not as interesting as what I've seen.
These private schools.
These private schools. And incidentally, let me just make it very clear. They're not some little minority pursuit, okay? So in Lagos, the state in Nigeria, what used to be the capital, it's now the commercial capital, the 71% of children, we did a household survey of the whole of the state, 71% of the children, school-aged children, are going to private schools. Only a quarter are going to government schools. And there are, well, the last time we checked, there are 14,000 of these schools.
Okay, that's not a minority.
It's not a minority. And the same figures roughly there in Monrovia, in Liberia, the same figures across the capital cities. And in rural areas, typically you might find 25-30% of poor children are in these private schools. So this is not a minority pursuit. This is a hugely successful thing. And so when people tell me about charter schools in America, I say, interesting, but could there be low-cost private schools? And I've just been doing a little study and finding that these low-cost private schools, particularly after the COVID lockdown and all the rest of it, they are starting to emerge.
Is this a phenomenon just in underdeveloped countries? Or, for example, in the United Kingdom, are there any inexpensive but good quality private schools?
Yes, so the phenomenon is just beginning. So whereas it's saturated the markets in Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, Liberia, and wherever, people are now just starting to look at the possibilities of a price range of schools in England and in America. So, for example, I was in a school in rural Mississippi recently. Completely a black community. It was in 2 trailers, and it was a private school charging about $3,500 per year. And the children there, I spoke to the children, the young men and women who were really what you might call refugees from a public school where there was bullying, there was intolerance, that they were feeling abandoned by the teachers.
What makes the difference for these private schools?
There are many features, but so one could just simply be the small scale. So a typical one of these little private schools I've seen in America now, they might only have 20, 25 children. That's one possibility. The second, of course, is the accountability. If the school loses, the profit margins or the surplus margins are very tight. If you lose one pupil, you'll probably go out of business. And one student, you go out of business. So therefore, they have to be very closely attuned to what the parents want, what the children want, and that accountability. So there's no abuse. There's no teachers who don't turn up. There's no teachers who don't teach, there's that accountability which means that the quality is higher.
When people tell you that public education is the best that society can do, is the best that a society can achieve, what do you answer back?
That's not been my experience. In fact, I went to what we call a state comprehensive school as a child myself. It's not that I'm a privileged person who's come through the private sector and just wants to...
You're nor an Eton graduate or from a very expensive public school.
Kingsfield,
from a very expensive private school, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Of course, in public school, the term in England is exactly the opposite.
I'm using public school as in the American sense. From the government.
Public school, government school. In England, a public school is a private school.
An elite private school, But that's just a quirk. The same is true in India, incidentally. India followed the British tradition there.
That's right.
But other countries didn't. But the key thing is, I haven't seen it for myself, and when I've traveled the world, one of the reviewers of my book said I had a severe dose of wanderlust, that I was traveling all the time.
Okay.
But I've seen so many different countries, from the Americas, Africa, North and Middle and West and East, and then Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia. I've seen across the world. And parents will, if you ask them that question, and it's true in England as well, government or private, which do you prefer? Private, always private. We always prefer private, and it's not for some snob value. So some of our critics say, it's just, they believe it's snobbish to want private. No, they tell you why they want private. They're fair to girls. They focus on teaching. They have proper discipline, but not, over-the-top discipline. They're close to our homes. We know the teachers respect the children, and so on and so forth. All the time, people know why they prefer private. And so, in a way, I mean, what my work has shown is that actually, in many countries, there's what did Lenin say? The withering away of the state. The idea of the withering away of the state in education as private schools grow and grow. And I'm interested in seeing whether the same could be true in Latin America, but also in America itself and in England.
What would you say to our Minister of Education, who has been pushing to expand public education, and now it's becoming more and more difficult for people to send their children to private schools? What should we be doing in Mexico or in a country like Mexico?
So I haven't been here long.
Okay, you're not
please
an expert
forgive
on
me.
Mexico.
I just make some comments, but my understanding is that the kindergarten and junior high school, secondary school, they're quite lightly regulated, and it's quite.
It's elementary education that's
elementary education is so heavily regulated. It's very hard to create private schools. I mean, what I'd say to the minister is, do you want educational excellence? In which case, look at the evidence from around the world. Excellence comes better through the private than the public system. Do you want schools that are scalable, that are sustainable? Do you want to say, okay, if they're private schools, but there are some people who are too poor, and that's always the case. There may be some people who are too poor to go there, or maybe we find something like vouchers or some philanthropic means of allowing them to go to where they would prefer to go if they only had the money.
Professor James Tooley, thank you very much for speaking with us about private education and why is what people want.
Yeah, thank you very much.
You. Y a usted, amigo, que hace posible este programa, se lo agradezco también. Esto es todo por hoy, pero no se lo olvide. Nos vemos la próxima.